How's it going, everyone? Welcome, Eliar Gonzalez here, and today let's going to take a look now at this Joy of React, which is a course taught by Josh Komura. So shout out to Josh Komura, a software engineer that has previously worked at Khan Academy, Gatsby, and now he hosts and he's currently the author of his own CSS in React Academy, right? So in today's video, we're gonna now end the model one, the fundamentals of React, which is a little bit of history, why it exists, how do we get here, and what are now the basics stuff that we need to put in place. But it all starts with this another course from the CSS. You know, the CSS for JavaScript developers. So actually, this is how this course began, and I'm gonna make a quick recap of at least the model one here, where it say, hey, let's go to take a look now at the fundamentals and this understanding, especially if you're going to learn something, it is important for you to challenge yourself. You're gonna pass from this stuff that makes you feel uncomfortable, but this is based on the science and some papers as well, where those recommend is to any time that instead of you going to a particular workshop, you set a several you look at particular instructions and then you replicate those instructions. So instead of doing that, this particular course, or anyone you want to learn something, it is first we're gonna show you something and how you can do that as a way to push yourself in your thinking. There is nothing wrong if you don't get that right in the first time, but the idea is that you can see and understand is now your gaps. So this is part of the error corrections paper that is mentioned, which it tells you the way of how you can learn stuff and by challenging yourself, and also with the intention. Instead of challenging, I will say that if you have the desire to learn something, whatever it is, you'll find the way. Now, that's also true when it describes when you're learning something, how your neuroplasticity is something that is triggered, especially when something is new, and when you dedicate your time and attention and the focus, and some biochemical stuff that happen in your body. Now, the idea is that once we are already look at that and understand that, is to also now be able to apply that to ourselves. And in this course with CSS as well as the React, it says that, hey, it'll be best for you to do an interleaving rather than blocking. What does it mean is that you go through this course, the model one of CSS, you describe what's going on, and then you move to the React, go to the model one, and then you go back and follow the CSS, and so on and so forth, right? He also showed him some of the tips or suggestions here. So based on that, first thing first is to describe the CSS briefly, at least the model 0, and by look at the intro of the MDM, which is, hey, what is CSS? What are the way of how you can add CSS, whether it is external files or internal external style sheets or internal style sheet or even inline, and then how you can now select each one of those elements, whether it's via selectors like tag or class or any other attributes, all right, via also the combinators as a way to get now these selectors or the descendant of those elements on the browser, all right? whether it's the direct child or direct ancestors or the next sibling, as well as the state base known as pseudo class and pseudo elements. Also, some of these functions or additional features of CSS, such as the function that comes with the language, whether it is the CSS, whether it's the color, the cal that allow you to perform mathematical operations, the translate, all of these small utility functions, as well as the add rules, where allow you to now is add behaviors to CSS, so tell CSS how to behave, right? So for example, media query is one of them. Layout, that means layer. So media layer, the keyframes, and recently now the view transition, which is something that I'm going to dive deep into this. Okay, and well, the comments. So now when we get into the basics, is to look at the anatomy of the rule. All right, what is a rule? What is a what is a what is a rule? What is a statement? What is a declaration, which is made of the property and the value? What is the what is the value? What is the unit, as well as the selector? And then look at the most common tools that are still relevant in 2025, according to Josh Comeva, that it's important at least to know, because it helps us to solve some of the common issues. So one of them is the media query, which is telling how CSS is going to behave to apply this set of rules, all right? As well as the selectors, such as the pseudo select, all right, or the pseudo classes like hover or focus. Why we care about focus? Because this is part of this is one of the selectors that we can use to solve some of the accessibility problems. So for example, which is the WCAG, or the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, right? Which stand for principles that this must be perceivable, that is operable, that is understandable, and here is where now the focus property actually makes sense here, and also is that is robust, right? So this is the principle of the CSS, and or at least to the accessibility of that, the WebCAG 2.1, all right? And then now how can we is and then now how can we is look at other common pseudo classes, like check for checkboxes and radio buttons, as well as the first and last child and first and last end type. What is the subtle difference? So the first is handled is the first direct ancestors of that element, whereas the second is handling is the first type of that selector, right? So again, very specific and common, helpful, nifty selectors that we can use. The other is the pseudo elements. So, for example, like the placeholder or the element, the before and after. This is more for decorative purpose. Okay, and look now at the color. So to understand is that this is a vast universe, but the thing here is in CSS we have now 4 formats of colors. We have the keyword for educational, we also have the hexadecimals, we have RGB because it makes much sense to actually pick up the color rather than the hexadecimal. But if you want some nuance, we use now the HSL format, which stands for hue, saturation, and luminosity. Now, the idea of that is we can now look at how can we pick a color, all right, and therefore we can now is pick some nuance color that we want to play with, right? So the hue, you have now, this represents as a ring of 0 to 360 degree of color. And then you have now the saturation that represents is how vibrant or gray south is a color. And the other is the luminosity, which if this is 50%, it represents now true color. Okay. Also, we look at the unit. Okay, so I'm doing all of this is because I want to create now that narrative. Also, we look at the combinators. So for example, the most common combinators that we might want to use, all right, like the send ancestors, the child selector, the other units like m, root m, and percentage. Most of the time we prefer to go with or to work with rem. Rem refers to the font size of the root elements, HTML, okay? And we use now is percentage to provide now the ability to the user now to make our website zoomable. And the other is the EM, which represent is the font size of the current element that you are. And the percentage, which is useful for calculating the height algorithm and some aspect ratio, that was something that we're going to later on look at that as well. So after that, we'll look at the typography, which is similar to the color. Now this is a broad topic that, because we're looking at is the fundamentals, we first describe is what is the font family, which is a multi-character set that, for example, in Roboto we have is six type of or 6 font width, all right, and 2 type formattings, which means that we have 12 character sets. So this is something that comes most of the time with the OS. So you have, for example, Tahoma, Arial, Times New Roman, but most of the times, because application wants to provide their own branding, all right, and because in the font families you also have these different types that come from serif to sans serif, which is this is a French word that says with grace or not. So sans serif is without grace, and serif is with that grace. So because most applications want to provide now is their own branding, their own unique experience. Applications like Airbnb for use now in-house custom fonts such as Cerealial, okay, and this is known as web font. So web font is something that you can download from a server, and that server, whether it's a Google or any other hosting server for fonts, or any font hosting server, that when you now wants to explore about a bit of the fonts and the formats of fonts, we have now bold for important stuff. We have now italic, because in person conversation there is a lot of clue that happen, which are non-oral. There is a lot of non-verbal communication clue that happens. So a way to describe those kind of stuff, italics is being used. So for example, when you want to quote something from a paper, all right, or when you use foreign language, or when you want to express thoughts of a characters, as well as okay. See, this is where the so we have italic. So the italic, we can use that for quoting content, representing the thoughts of characters, or some scientific concepts. So for example, Homo sapiens, or as well as to any foreign language. Represents also TV books, TV series, books, and that kind of stuff. And another format is so we talk about bold, italic, and underline, which is mainly to indicate that this is now a hyperlink, as well as some other style and semantics. So for example, like M and strong, and why this particular tag is being used, especially to help those assisted technologies or non-pointer apps. So for example, like the web, the mouse, or the pointer, to now emphasize this kind of words. We also look at the text alignment, left, center, right, the text text alignment, text spacing, all right, whether it is letter spacing or line height. Line height is a property that the accessibility guidelines, the WCAG 2.1, is telling you that this must be at least 1.5, all right, in your website. So it's good to know about that, as well as text transformation. Hey, I want to make all of these uppercase or lowercase, and some debugging tools that are quite helpful here. I briefly may describe the fundamentals here, which is by walking through the story of the CSS, which is what is the anatomy of a CSS rule, and then the most common that are still quite relevant: media queries, selectors, such as pseudo selectors, pseudo elements, combinators, color, units, in typography. All right. Again, this is just to describe the basics, right? So we have here is the rules, media queries, selectors, pseudo selectors, pseudo class, pseudo elements, the combinator, the most common combinator, unit, color, and text on typography. Only 9 concepts here, just to make things short. Now, finally, what we really care in today's video is how that is combined to React, and how now React emerged here. Again, because this is the introduction, and there are 13 models okay? Uh, which is something that I think that is gonna take me quite amount of time. But in any case, the fundamentals here is to first look at the magic of React or understand the history of React and how that emerged from a particular issue that Facebook has to handle this icons where now when these phantom icons, when people now click on that icon and to look if they have new message, but when they see, then they're figuring out that there is no new message. So because that particular piece of UI, whether it's on the widget, the main view, and the icon, each one of them were separate view, and the state is managed independently. If you are a Facebook, that's when you have a lot of engineering and people working behind the scenes, so you definitely now wants to solve that, especially when your users are complaining about it. Now the thing here is with this, there was with this particular challenge, and imagine also that as you fix and deliver some new features, so this particular issue comes around, and then you starting to fix that issue and resolve another bug fix, for example, another come up, this new issue comes up again. So they internally have they were developing internally a tool known as React, where the beautiful thing of React is that say, hey, let me now is have the UI and the state in sync. That's the value proposition of React, okay? And if you compare that, for example, with Vue, where they say, hey, I'm going to now manage all of this state, and I'm gonna keep track of all of this state using proxy behind the scenes, okay? So you don't worry about how many state you're going to put here or there or whatever. You just only focus is on building your user interface. And I think that this is the value proposition, something that is powerful, and why a lot of companies are now using its Vue, and they now push their energy and attentions to use Vue. But in any case, this is a React core, so deal with it. So we look at these new features in React Native, which is some minor features to improve the developer experience, as well as the stabilization of server components, and the introduction to the Actions API, a way of how you can now handle is forms in React, right? So because of that, and we look at now how can we create is our own React, okay? The Hello React. So because at the end of the day here, this is a library that we can now insert in our index HTML, and then select an element on the body, so we can now inject our own components, aka our own elements, using now the create element from React. And since this is now is an object that we can pass is, so the first, or this is a function that have 3 parameters. So the first is the tag, the second is the property that this, or the attribute that this tag will have, and the third is the content. And this content can have several things inside of that. So once we look at how to build our own React application, how to render that, we are able to understand what actually React is doing. It's just a function that is going to take this particular element that you create and the entry points, and the render function, what it's going to do is to say, hey, I'm going to create this element with this object that you pass me here, So for example, like this. Maybe not in the best way possible. But I'm gonna create now is an element here with this property that you pass me here, and then I'm going to now mount that component or append that component into the DOM. And I'm gonna do that for every component that you have defined here, right? So the idea is to look at that. Look at how you can create your own. Look at how you can create your first React application and what it's doing behind the scenes, and then now when it comes to understand the JSX, which is this particularly formats to make it your life much more simpler to write these kind of applications. We use this because it becomes quite monotonous and tedious to go with. So we look at the concept of compiling and transpiling. So transpiling is when you want to convert from one language to another high order language or high level language, where compiling says is I want to transform this language into machine readable code. All right. So even though we're gonna use the concept of compile rather than transpiling, but for this instance it's not relevant actually. And how do we skip the import of React? But at the end of the day, especially in our entry point, what is doing React is any time that is going to analyze our application, or when the transpilation phase happens, because JSX is not an standard, all right? So anytime that this phase actually happens, and the transpilation phase, React, what it's going to do is to transform this, all right, into create elements here, right? So it's going to transform this into now a particular component with this shape, okay? And then now append that to the container, to the DOM. So this was a common stumbling block for beginners because, as you can see, what it's doing behind the scenes is like this, right? So the TLDR of this is, despite that we can now have the ability to avoid skipping React or not, but I prefer to go with React because it actually makes sense of what's going on there. It's going to analyze that piece of code and then going to recreate the JavaScript syntax that browser understood, so you can now have that UI per se. Which is the reason why we have JSX and JSX and so on and so forth. So there is also another concept here on understanding JSX, about what is JSX, the compile and transpile. Why do we sometimes skip the import of React? Why we don't skip the import, at least for meaningful aspect? And then we look at the expression slot, all right, which is going to evaluate now is a JavaScript value. This is the reason why a lot of people must look at JavaScript first rather than any other topics, okay? So yeah, this is now the expression slots, as I mentioned, and what are the kind of expressions that you can have, as well as the statement here. This is just the statements involved is an action, is an instruction, declare something that's gonna happen. So for example, assigning or creating a variable, or returning something, or iterating until a condition is met, or even the comment here is another expression slot. is an statement. An expression slot is, for example, anything that produces a value, right? So that's what I mentioned, that why this is important, okay, to understand that, because when you are rendering this kind of elements here, and then you're going to pass this, you might think that you can say, hey, this specific content that I'm going to pass as the content here, right? Or this specific component that I'm gonna pass, this will be transformed into JavaScript. And again, if you use now if, would it make that now sense to do that? You know? So this actually doesn't make sense here. If shopping list is like greater than less 5, so almost done. This actually doesn't make sense. So this is one of the reasons why, which is something that we're gonna see that later on, why we can now rendering stuff in React, okay, and why there is a specific way of rendering stuff in React, right? So we also look at the comment in JSX, like simple normal JavaScript, and attribute expressions. So here is when you say, hey, I want to now pass this, or I want you to evaluate JSX, this expression, and anything that is on curly braces, it say, hey, I want you to evaluate this JavaScript expression, and this is how it's going to compile this. All right, so hey, I'm going to now assign this value to this ID. All right, as in when I'm going to build this element, when I'm going to run is the create element, it is going to be compiled like that, and then some type conversion here that is so for example, you can also do things like this, and this will be a valid JavaScript statements, because they remember that at the end of the day, it's just an object that you are building here. When you pass this, some of the type conversion that happens, so for example, it's true, or this one, all right? I prefer to be explicit about that, and similar to the input type and so on and so forth, as well as the difference from HTML. Okay, so we have now reserved words. So for example, for in class, you can use for, you can use the HTML form. This is for any a label, and the class name, which is something that behind the scenes, JavaScript actually, this is the way how it access to those values on the class. All right, you can take a look at that. So for example, if you create now an element, say, hey, this is an element, right? And this element will be document dot create element. All right, and here you say, hey, this will be now a paragraph. No, a paragraph. Okay. So after I create that paragraph, which is this, I'm going to call is now the description. Say description. Okay. So this description now allows you to access to some properties. For example, you say description, and then here you want to have access to that class attribute. You can say class name, all right, and it's gonna give you, it is the class name that you have, right? So in our case it's empty because we don't assign anything. But if we say let hero, and we say document dot get create element, they say assign this div, all right, and then right below the hero I say set style or set attribute here, say hey, this will be now the class followed by certain other classes, you know. You say hey, this will be the hero, or if you are for Halloween, you can say that hey, this will be now flex and flex wrap, you know. That'll be all. And now when you want to have access to the class name, it's gonna give you this, right? So now this is part of the difference from HTML. One of them is the reserved words, okay, like for and class, and cell closing tags, all right. So for example, any content based tag like input or image, all right, they are self content, so you can use is now the self closing tag to only describe that. That'll be work. The other is the case sensitive between tags. You can put now lower uppercases tags. You must follow is that particular pattern. And the case sensitive attributes. Again, this is the difference, and we're not done here. We are not definitely done. Oh, come on. You have to restart it. Okay, no problem. No problem. Okay. You know what is great of all of this is that now Josh give me permission to record this video. And you can now follow me along, and I think that's pretty neat. Absolutely. Case insensitive and attributes here. Exactly. Which is the case sensitive attributes as well as the inline style. And here, this is a very important topic here that a lot of people actually overflew what's happened here, especially on inline style. So remember that so far we went through describe what the React is. How do we get here? How can we create our own first React? And then how can we create our own basic React? And then why we need to use is JSX. What is the problem that JSX solve? And what is transpiling and compiling? Understand is why is that when we pass now this JSX syntax, it doesn't crash. All right, because React behind the scene is now analyzing that document with the library, which is transforming is those JSX content into valid JavaScript expression and a statement. And how now the difference between the JavaScript statement and expression is something important to know. All right, because this is the foundation of something that we're gonna see that later. For example, conditional render. So Here we also look is the expression slots, how you can use this, coming in JSX, attributes, expressions, and type coercion, okay, and how that is now converted, and then the difference from HTML, from the reserved word like HTML4, like 4, and class HTML4 and class name, the self-closing tags, as well as the case-sensitive tags. All right. So, for example, is that there are now case-sensitive tag and the case-sensitive attributes. And what's going on behind the scenes when you need to pass is, for example, inline style. So case-sensitive attributes, so for example, is like the on-click or autoplay and all that kind of stuff, right? So there are also some specific. So for example, like on-click, tap index, and the stroke dash array, okay? Data attribute is something that is not have these case sensitive attributes. You can use that as it is. So there's two sections to camel casing here, which is that. And the other that I think that is quite important is the inline style, fellas. Is the inline style, my friend. Yep. And why this is important? So in the different from HTML, we have reserved word, the HTML4 and class name. We also have the self-closing tag, the sensitive case, okay? So case-sensitive attributes, case-sensitive tags, case-sensitive attributes. So for example, like on click and autoplay or stroke dash array or tap index, okay? As well as the case-sensitive attributes like data or area, right? So this is the two sections to this case-sensitive. So data test and error label, they're not, okay? They're useful for testing, for automated testing. And the other is the inline style. And why I hit the brake here with inline style, because this is another difference on HTML, is that instead of passing you this, all right, you are passing here is in this shape form. And you might wonder, why do I need to pass this why do I need to do this curly braces? Because here we are creating is an object that will be attached to the style that will be contain all of this property as it is. So if you can imagine, when you do the create react element, it makes a lot of sense to actually create an object and then pass this to the style, something that is not true for the other properties, but it does for inline style, and it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense. Double squiggly bracket. It might seem weird that we need two set of squiggly bracket, but why can we write like this? And there is an explanation for that. You recall from the last lesson that we use squiggly bracket to inject JavaScript expression in our JSX. Okay? Squiggly bracket or curly bracket. Okay? So we use curly bracket. So we use, so why exactly why double curly bracket? Okay. Why double curly brackets? That's a good question. As you can see, as you can see in previous lessons, JSX use curly brackets to create objects, or to inject JavaScript expressions. To inject, JSX use curly brackets. Uses curly brackets to inject JavaScript expressions. Okay. To inject JavaScript expressions. So, because if you want to inject is now a JavaScript expression like this. For font style, we want to pass an object containing the CSS that we want to set ender value. So for style, we want to pass an object that contain all of the CSS, or all of the style, all of the CSS properties we want to set. Okay, good. That's what it is. So rather than create a variable, we create an object that contains, that's interesting, we create an object that contains their style. It is style. We create an object that contains in this style. So from this example is to say, hey, I'm gonna recreate this, okay? But instead of putting as a custom style, I'm gonna create now an object of this shape and form. I create this object of this shape and form. We say, hey, font size to root element. This is the reason why we went through that quick recap of CSS, to understand that this is a declaration in CSS. We are now defining is the rule here, okay, as well as the font weight of bold, right? So we're defining is the size as well as the weight of this. This is the reason why it's part of the difference in CSS with HTML. Okay, so the difference from HTML, we look at the reserved words, which is the HTML4 in class, the closing tag, the case sensitive tags that they must match to what it is, the case sensitive attributes, which is now you follow is this lower uppercase, right, which is this on click, for example, or on dash stroke. Okay, so stroke, dash array, or tab index, the first letter on E is this, so on click, tab index. Okay, stroke dash array. In some cases where this doesn't really care, or this doesn't apply, right? So for example, like data test ID as well as the area, and they're useful for labeling elements for automating tests. And the other, and very important, is inline style. All right, so you are now injecting JavaScript expressions in your JSX elements, and because we want to now pass is a list or a collections or a rule, okay, of CSS that we want to set, we create now an object here. So we have to be careful that the reason to recap this section is very, very important, because with this understanding of GSS, which is understand the difference between transpiling and compiling, and why this and what is happening, what is wrong, as well as skipping the React. Oh, it seems that it's rich. Hola. Voy bajando. Listo. So yeah, it came here. But I want to recap these sections to provide now some sort of order. So in React, we look at the reason why React emerged. All right, the magic of React, sort of speaking. How can we use React? How can we recreate our own React? And therefore, understanding is the reason why we use JSX as a way to automate a lot of process, especially when you have to type a lot. All right, you want to abstract yourself from that and use now a more HTML syntax like, where it allows you to now evaluate expressions inside of that, and the difference between an expression and a statement. So we look at the expression slots, the comments in JSX, the attribute expressions of how you can do the type coercion in those attributes expressions, as well as the difference of HTML, okay, whether it is by reserved word, their self-closing tags, the case-sensitive tags, case-sensitive attributes. So for example, on clay or tab index or stroke dash array, but this is not true for area and data, and also for the inline. All right, and also for the inline, why we use this double curly bracket. So I'm gonna make a quick pause here. I'll be right back. And we're back now. As we were describing here, the reason of looking at the inline style, okay, is because of that you are going to create now an object that is going to be injected at JSX, that by the time that is going to create now that element using the React create element, is going to say, hey, what is the tag of this? And for example, in this case is H1. All right, cool. What is now their attributes that are going to put at the second parameter? Well, in this case, it's a style as a key and object as a value. All right, so what is now the content of this? Well, it is hello world. And this is the reason why it is important to understand this specific content, and something that you might consider you might consider, because if for some reason now that particular object here is bind to some sort of state, that any time that state change, and therefore is going to impact here, because now you're going to reevaluate this object. So you have to be careful on that, right? And the other is that anytime that you are creating now a new object here, you are also, well, know that it's gonna be re-rendering this. So in any case, but again, it's quite important to understand this, why we actually need to pass those states. And all properties are written in camel case. So for example, like this, all CSS properties are written in camel case. All right. Oh, that's there you got it. So all properties are written in camel case. every dash is replaced by capitalizing the subsequent word, where another word is this, background position became background position, border bottom becomes border bottom color, and so even the vendor prefix like WebKit font smoothing. So we capitalize the first letter as well as the WebKit font smoothing. Also, we automatically apply the PX suffix for certain CSS properties. For example, like this. So this is part of the pattern here. Okay. So this is the pattern here. Now, one important topic here is this. It is common that, it is common in React that don't put the values of the CSS properties, since it handles the PX for us, right? So for example here, but as a good practice, and this is something that you might not going to deal with, but you're gonna see that, okay? You're gonna see that a lot. Because for example, this code, you have to watch out for properties that takes unitless values. So watch out for property that takes unitless values like flex and line height. For example, this code as it is, right? I don't know why they love to add this kind of format. I don't know why is that, but it thinks that it loves this. And I say, come on, 0 here, and then apply that. There you got it. All right. Oh, here we go, bro. Okay. Now, this is what is the common convention. Well, there is a common convention in React to use unitless values. You can absolutely use full unit if you prefer, right? Exactly. So, in this case, I will prefer to use now the specific unit here to handle those edge cases, because again I want to have now certainty here. I want to have is certainty here. So we get this. Oh, for real? You got it? There you got it. All right. And all of this. Okay, I get it. Okay, I get it. Okay. Okay, I get it. Okay, I get it. Good. Are inline style bad? They're an escape hatch, like important, and should only be used as a last resort in a specialized circumstance. Personally, I agree that we shouldn't use inline style as our primary method of styling, but I think there is a lot of cases where inline style are a way to go. This is especially true with modern CSS and CSS variable. Look at this. But I think there is a lot of cases where inline style are a way to go. Are inline style bad? Okay. You might have heard that inline style shouldn't be used exactly. You might have heard that inline style shouldn't be used exactly, shouldn't be used. They are an escape hatch like an important, okay, they are like an escape hatch like important, all right, like important here, and should only be used as a last resort in a specialized circumstance, and should only be used as a last resort in specialized circumstances. Okay, yeah, you got it. Personally, I agree that we shouldn't use inline style as our primary method of styling, but I think there is a lot of cases where inline style are a way to go. This is especially true with modern CSS and CSS variable. While it is not really the focus on this course, we'll see some examples that showcase how CSS variable can be used with React to tremendous effect. Interesting. Okay. However, is this? So personally, it is about its use cases. So personally, I don't think. Okay. So personally, I don't think there's a lot of cases where inline styles. Okay. Personally, I don't think we should use as our primary methods, as our primary method of styling. Makes sense. However, in some scenarios, okay, however, in some scenarios, this is in some scenarios, inlines are a way to go. In some scenarios, inline are the way to go. Like modern CSS with modern CSS. I think they were using readable and that kind of stuff with modern CSS and CSS variables. That's interesting. And then we look now at the fix the converter to understand now this. I already passed that, so that's why I have this high score of 100%. So good. Again, to understand these nifty details, because at the end of the day, that's what you're getting paid for. And that's when you have now a keen eye of what you have looked before, you say, that's right. This is how I get it. No, this is to hone that on. Right.
So as a React developer, there's going to be times where you have a chunk of HTML that you want to use in your React application. Maybe you're converting a legacy site to use React, Or maybe you even just found a cool snippet online, but it's in HTML, and so in order to use it in your React application, you have to convert it to JSX. In this game, we're going to practice spotting those differences by helping a fictitious coworker debug a fictitious tool. And here's the scenario. Imagine that your coworker is working on a tool that automatically converts HTML to JSX, with the idea being that you can copy paste your HTML into this tool, and it'll spit out the JSX that then you can copy paste into your React application. But the problem is that the tool your friend is building is buggy, doesn't always work. And so here's an example of what that looks like. We have this HTML input, which is totally valid HTML, and this is the JSX output, but there are some problems with it. Like we see it has ID name, and when it comes to class, we do have to change that into class name, but we don't have to change ID into ID name. So this is a mistake that this fictitious tool has caused. So because we found a mistake, we can click on it, and we see that it gets circled and outlined. It also shows you the corresponding markup in the HTML for convenience. But what else? I see there's still one undiscovered problem. Well, in HTML, style is a string. That's good and normal. But in JSX, we need style to be an object. We need to transform this so that it works. So this is our second problem. And with that, we have caught the two problems in this example. So that's the premise of this exercise. You're shown some valid HTML and some invalid JSX, and your job is to spot the problems in the JSX. If you don't use a pointer device, there is an alternative control scheme you can use that is essentially multiple choice based using the keyboard, so you will be given that option as well. But yeah, have fun with this one.
Absolutely. I did. I think this is the screenshot. Yeah, I think this is the screenshot. Quick look. No, what the French stuff is this? Oh, there you got it. Is this one? Quick look. And there you got it. Is this one? There you got it, but without you. Just fix the converter. So we begin with, well, let me remove all of this. Okay, no. Right, and the last one. Well, the last one doesn't care, doesn't matter. But we start with this. Exactly. Here we're going to put all of this. All right. The same for this. And this another one. And this another one. And this another one. And this another one. And there you go. Well, this is all of these examples here, and again, well, this is my score. But for hello world, sign up form, funky buttons, in new articles, for example, like this, news articles, okay, again, I don't want to dive deep too much into this. We can go over that particular game, but it's not what we're going to pass in today's video. So, let's go to the white space gotcha. There is a section for that, my friend. Holy moly. The white space gotcha. Oh my god. So the white space gotcha. Holy moly. Okay. I don't know why they don't make this in the same. Okay, no. Why in the French toast not? Oh, come on, for real? You gotta be kidding me. That's right. An HTML. Okay. Not sure why this cannot be feed here. I get it here, but why this cannot be put down below there? Anyway. Alright. Good. The white space gotcha. Jesus. Oh my god. So let's talk about one common gotchas with JSX, especially when we're trying to inject white space. Here's a quick example, right? Until Santa returns, he wants to, well, now add some particular space. Notice how there is no space between the ball and the text, ball text and number. Instead, return is doing this, right? It is showing as return very close to this. To understand why this happened, let's consider the JSX. This JSX compiles to JavaScript. Remember that at the end of the day, okay, what it's doing behind this thing is creating now an object where the first, so first you have now the tag. Okay, we can think of this like the tag, where the tag here is a div. All right. We also have now is the props, sort of speaking, or attributes. We're gonna call these props. And here, well, there is no props attached to that, so this is now like an empty string here. And then we have now is, as the content is the, so it's gonna put here, the content of the children is this content, right? Which is now strong, okay, and all of this, right? Strong, then send until returns, and this one, right? So, as you can see here, all right, parsing error unexpected is okay, it doesn't matter. But this is the HTML tag that we are passing through that as the children here. So this is the root, this is the props, so we are not actually passing any props or attribute here. And now this is the children here. So now, because this is something that is going to be compile, okay, by saying is, hey, we're going to create now an element. This is pretty much like we say, hey, it's going to create now on children is the react dot create element, which is now a strong, okay, and therefore this element is strong have is no attributes so far, but here we want us to pass now an attribute, which is this days until, we can say this will be a props, which is an object, okay, it will be now an object called props that will have now, for example, has the content here. It's gonna say, well, that whatever value you have assigned to date until returns true, and then now the children, which is the content you want to render, okay, and the content you want to render is, well, the content you want to render here is this date until Santa returns. Now, so because we create this element, and also we are creating is another children here, because that's the reason why we can pass is several elements here. We also are creating now is this react.create element, right? Because now we want is to render is this, okay? So yeah, we're not passing is this. There is no prop. This is now empty. But here, there is something interesting here. What is the assumption that the React is going to do if you don't pass any tag to this? So the guess is, well, I'm going to transform this into a div. I'm going to pass this now this thing that you need to, and that'll be all, right? There is no content. So I want you to somehow is render that content that I'm passing to you, right? Somehow render that content that I'm passing to you. So as you can see, this is exactly how I'm creating is this, all right? In the days until Santa returns. So exactly, this is part of the structure of the div here, right? This is part of the structure of this div. So it's gonna be more precise here with what we want to do, which is this, which is react dot create element, and here we say this is a div, right? This is a div. There is a property that we're gonna pass nothing, and the child as it is, right? And then somehow this thing, you know, this thing's called dates to return. Exactly. Dates to return. This is the content, and this is it, right? So this is the same structure as this, right? So our dates have two children, the strong tag and the days until Santa returns variable. Remember, JSX doesn't compile to HTML, it compiles to JavaScript. And when that JavaScript is executed, it's only going to create and append two HTML nodes to this. So a strong tag with some text, exactly, JSX doesn't compile to HTML, it compiles to JavaScript. That's right. And when that JavaScript is executed, it's only going to create and append two HTML nodes. So you have the strong tag with some text here. That's right. And the text no for the number 123. How do we fix this? The most common solution is to add a single white space character in curly braces. Is to add a single white space character in curly braces. So, of course, this is not going to render. A curly bracket. Okay. So you say something like this. Okay. Holy fuck. So this actually add that white space. So how do we do this? The most common solution is to add a single white space characters in curly brace. Like this. Or this. But it's only going to take now that. Because at the end of the day, it's going to convert that into JavaScript. Right? And then you can do something like this. Here is how this compiles. So this will compile into create React element with a div, and the props, and the children that'll have now 1, 2, 3 children to be rendered. Okay. One of the strong, 2 as an empty string, and 3 as the def until Santa returns. Okay, because it's not creating its element. It's not creating an element. I'll admit, when I first looked this trick, I thought it was really hacky, bro. I wish that the React team will fix this bug and make it handle white space the same way that HTML does. I come to realize that this behavior is actually more of a feature than a bug. Let's talk about it. Okay.
So what is the purpose of a white space character on the web? Well, it's hard to say because the exact same character serves 2 very different and really completely separate purposes. The first one, I think the one we probably think of, is literally to add spaces between words, right? It's a grammatical character that's used in a grammatical way. But that exact same character is used by developers to use for indentation, right? For code readability in a way that isn't meant to be seen by users, but is purely for our benefit as developers. And how is the browser supposed to know which one you want, right? In some cases, it's obvious if it's literally between 2 words, but shouldn't this space over here be indentation? And if we ignore all of this space, then where is this space coming from? So this is like a really weird thing on the web, that it's not to say that the way JSX does it, where it ignores indentation like this, is the right way, but it's more that like this is a fundamentally weird thing that doesn't have a perfect solution. And you might be thinking, well, wait, isn't this, even if it seems a little strange, isn't it better? Well, what's the circumstance, right? Like here's another circumstance where I have 3 images that are side by side. I haven't put any explicit white space characters between them, right? I've just indented my code, and yet I actually do have a single white space character between each image. If I want to get rid of that character, I have to remove my indentation. I have to literally put the images like right up against each other in the code, which also feels really strange and wrong. So this is one of those frustrating problems where there really isn't a perfect solution. And in fact, even in HTML, it depends on the layout mode that you're in within CSS. So if I go back to how it was, the white space comes back, but then on the div I set display flex. Well, check out what happens, right? The white space goes away again because in the flexbox algorithm, no amount of white space is significant. It doesn't matter what I do. Flexbox only cares about the raw elements and text nodes that you create, and it puts them all right together, and you can use, You can use gap if you want to separate them or whatever.
You want to separate this.
It's all to say that this is a weird thing. Like, it's a weird thing that developers do, which is using the exact same character in these totally different ways. And I actually think the way React does it is among the better ways. So in React, it ignores any space that it thinks serves an indentation code readability purpose. And that does mean that occasionally you'll find yourself in a situation like this where you actually do want there to be a space. And so the solution is to create an explicit space character, right? To tell the JSX compiler, hey, no, wait.
Exactly, to tell the JSX compiler, is like, hey, when you're reading here, I want you to include this white space followed by that. And it is interesting because this is all a debate around the white space and why this is important.
Wait a minute. This particular space is actually meant to be a space character. It's kind of cool that there's an explicit way to do this. And we don't have that option in Flexbox, right? Like, I can't really do this. I guess maybe, let's try it. I could maybe do a non-breaking space character. Let me get rid of the gap. Yeah, so like this is the character code for a particular kind of white space. But I don't think this is as intuitive as this. So, you know, you have to kind of pick your poison here. And I don't think the way React does it is wrong.
That's interesting. Here's the 3-image playground from the video. Exactly. So, because now React is handling those white spaces in this way, right? So if you say, hey, I want to make all of these elements to be displayed as a flex, okay, and add some gap to this, like 8 or 6, right? But it seems that it doesn't work properly. It's ignoring that. Over the past few years, a formatting tool called Prettier has taken this JavaScript community by storm. Pretty is a tool that will automatically format our code for us. It's opinionated and follows convention used by the majority of, yeah, I get it. Pretty is a tool that will automatically format our code for us. It is opinionated and follows conventions used by majority of JavaScript developers. Here's the good news. Prettier knows about this whitespace gotcha and will automatically add the whitespace character for us when necessary. On this course, we have integrated Prettier into the code playground, and you can trigger it by clicking the icon. What? It crashed dramatically. Or by using the save keyboard shortcut. Later in this course, we'll learn how to use Prettier in our own projects, and you can check it now here if you're curious. I think this is now the tools to trade, like Prettier, and how to do that kind of stuff. Configuring Prettier to say Prettier.print width, Prettier.single quote, Prettier.trailing comma, so on and so forth. Disabling Prettier. This is an escape hatch. To give you an idea, in the code base of this course platform, 800 JavaScript TypeScript files and 50k line of code, I use Prettier ignore about 30 times. Prettier ignore 30 times. Interesting. Identify issues with Prettier. When I write code, I constantly hitting the save shortcut to format my code. Sometimes, however, the code won't be formatted. The save shortcut will appear to have no effect. This usually means there are a syntax error. If Prettier can't format the code, it means that the code is invalid JavaScript. As a result, I discovered bug more quickly because I noticed right away when Prettier doesn't fire. If you hit the save shortcut every 60 seconds, you'll always know that you mess up within the last minute. And Prettier can help you to find the issue as well. Often by starting by deleting a chunk of code and trying to format. If it works, it means the issue is within the chunk I delete. If it doesn't, I delete another chunk and try again. But this is something, so it actually adding that trailing comma, and you can check off that. I strongly recommend these settings. It makes life much easier once you get used to it. Oh, this is on format, on save. That's right. Prettier is an opinionated code formatter. Yes, it's an opinionated code formatter. But the white space gotcha. Well, actually, this already crashed, which is not good. But here, exactly, I'm about to add now 8 or 9 gap. Okay, now it's working. So in other words, it's rendering itself. Exactly, it's rendering the element. So this is an iframe that is loading that over and over and over. So this white space hack, all right, is a way for React. Okay, the way how can we add white space feels hacky, since this doesn't happen like in HTML. The way we add, exactly, the way we add white space feels hacky, since this doesn't happen like HTML. All right, and therefore we need to tell the JSX compiler that we want to add a white space. For example, consider the following code. Like this. So this code compiles to this. All right, which is great. This code compiles to this. All right, by adding this white space. So this is how you can now add this white space here. And another gotcha here is with the image. So tools like Prettier that's quite interesting. So tools like Prettier consider now this example. Can you spot the difference? Can you spot the difference? All right. Can you spot the difference? Because this the code playground is using exactly. So because this code playground is using React or prettier behind the scenes, it automatically is putting a white space when we add a break line, right? It's not putting is that. Let me see if this is true for the other one, right? So for example, like this. Exactly, but when another text gets rendered, so if this is rendered here, it will now properly do that. But if you want for some reason render that here, because the way how now JSX is compiling this code into JavaScript, remember it's creating this element, okay, behind the scene is creating the element, all right. You say, hey, React create element with the div and some of the properties, some of the props, and also, hey, create React element, and on the children you say, hey, create React element of the strong with this, and then now it's then injecting the content here as another node, okay. There is no way to notify or to know about that white space. Therefore, this is how can we add this white space. Holy moly. All right. Okay. Holy French toast. So exercise, search form. Here we are. There you got it. Okay, exercise. So here we are, right? Here's the raw HTML that we got here. There you go. And the exercise, search form. Okay. Okay, search form. In this exercise, we'll build an inline search form. So accepting criteria. Good. A single search form, bro. Below you will find the raw HTML code that produce the UI we want. Your job is to convert it to JSX so that it can be used in React. The UI should match the screenshot above. All right. No error that's right. No error should be shown in the result pane. No warning should be logged in the console pane. Note, the console isn't clear automatically when the warnings are fixed. You can refresh the preview pane with this icon. So here we're going to create now this form, right? In this exercise, we're going to build an inline search form. Let's get into this. An inline search form. You know, basic stuff, bro. Basic stuff. So we want to know a label, So the form of this is we want to have now an input, we want to have a text, and input, and some button here. Okay. So let's get into this. This is the structure. The structure will be now is a label. So label, and then inside of that we're gonna have is the input. Label, right? This will be the label. I'm gonna say search. Oh, it's already center. That's interesting. Then we're gonna have now an input. Okay, the input. Okay. And then we're gonna have now a bottom. Okay, something like this. That's right. Of the type submit, right? It's interesting that it's not taking that button as it is. Then we have some class here that we want to go with. Oh, this is the accepting Joe's custom CSS resets. All right, box arrow, body. Okay, this is part of the reset here. Hey, all of the before and after must be box sizing border box. So to include, so is we're gonna start counting from, so the width, it will be for the border box. It includes now the padding here. All of them will have margin 0. HTML body will be 100%. Body, line height 1.5. WebKit font smooth anti-aliasing. This particular elements, canvas and SVG, I want you to display that as a block and give this math width of 100%. Okay. The input button text area and select the fonts will be whatever is inherit. The paragraph and all the H1s will say, hey, overflow wrap break word. Okay. The root and the next is his isolation. That's interesting. I'm not aware of this. The other is this box sizing border box, line height. The HTML font family will be sans serif, pretty straightforward. Body will be padding and 0. The border background is using now color, hue, saturation, and lightness. If you want to apply now some sort of opacity, you can say is 5, for example, or 4. I think it's 4. Exactly, 0.1, 0.2, 0.3. This is now applying the opacity for that. Right, if you want to apply some opacity here, but that's not. The root element will say the mean height will be 100%. So take all the available height. You're gonna display all of these elements as a flex. All right. This is part of the selector here. This selector and the next is using now the isolation isolate, which is quite interesting CSS property. I know I'm not aware of that. What does CSS isolation mean, bro? CSS isolation properly determine whether an element must create a new stacking context. A new stacking context. A new stacking context. Okay, new stacking context. It's creating a new stacking context. Whether is this element must be creating a new stacking context. Isolate mode. So it's creating like a new stacking context. Auto, small square this, and a new stacking context. Okay, this go beyond the scope of this. Interesting. We know is that we create now the form to say, hey, take all the available width. Max width will be 400. Display in a flex all of these elements, and align items to the center. And now create is a new stacking context. That's interesting, bro. That's interesting. This isolation is creating now a new stacking context. What is the stacking context? Stacking from front end, UI. Oh my god. Front-end system design. A new stacking context. Stacking context. Hey, these elements will be the position reference to the child component, which means now the browser create a stacking context. And a stacking context. And a stacking context. When we build layout, we only work on X and Y axis, meaning everything is placed in a single layer. But here we are now creating this stacking context. We're telling the browser, hey, these elements, we are now going to create a stacking context. Stacking context like this. It's gonna create this stacking context. So in here you are saying that the container is creating its own stacking context. Alright. But if you say now isolate, exactly, if you say now isolate like that, I cannot change that, cannot modify this. Well, anyway. You are telling that I want to create a stacking context, and when you do that, you can tell the browsers to do some performance optimizations to this layer here, or to focus your attention onto that layer, into that stacking context. Isolate or author. Determine whether an element must create a new stacking context. The author is have that, while the other is this. Exactly. Isolating is creating now a new stacking context here. Interesting. Isolate author and isolate. Exactly. Author and isolate. Big square, which is all of this, and then you have the small square with the isolation author. Mix blend mode different, and then you have now the big square Okay, so you can see how these elements are now blending each other in this stacking context. So for example, if I move this and then I say top, let's say 50 pixels, not too much. Okay, if I say now top 0 here and say top 10 pixels or minus 10, it's not gonna create now unless I say display this element into a relative position. Where now the small square where the isolation outer must be, for example, here is this absolute. This display absolute. I mean, it's relative. Sorry, is relative, and this will be is the absolute. All right. Where here you can now indicate is this. Position relative, exactly. But is this is position absolute, right? But if you put that as a position absolute, you of course gonna lose the benefit. But if you say position of this element will be absolute, and okay, it's gone. But the element is there. Exactly, the element is there. It's not just the author. So it's because you create now a new. That's to me is quite interesting here. So you're creating is now a new execution, is new stacking context. All right. So by doing this, you're creating a new stacking context. If you want to move the position of this, you're gonna handle is by margin top 50 pixels. Or if you say now padding top, that's interesting here, because you create now is this. And that is not being affected for that. Exactly, and it won't affect because it's the element in it itself. Exactly, but they are now putting one in terms of the another. So with isolate, it created its own that. Isolation auto and isolate, it create now that this is full green. Exactly, it's full green. If this is now isolating context, it's creating a new stacking context. It's not blending here. Or is not looking at the difference here. Holy moly. This is a very specific, but again, it's to create this stacking context. Okay, all right. First time I see that this one, by the way. So you have now the input, the hive and the padding and all that kind of stuff. Flex Y, border, border, bottom, outline, offset, outline, color, and margin left. And submit button here to display this, justify content, align items with height, background, border, border bottom, border radius, outline, offset here. Oh, this is the class. Okay, and followed by an image here. So this is the class. Submit button. This is the selector. So here you have now is this class, submit button. All right, and then you're gonna have now an image here that I don't know where the image come from, right? But is this right? And the closing tag for those images, right? So far so good. Now that we create this, okay, the UI should match this. Search and this one, right? Invalid dom pro, because it's class name. It's because it's class name. Exactly, and there you got it. So here we are, what we're doing is creating is, we're telling JSX to create now an element form that doesn't have any props right now, but it will contain is as children is this, and this element, all right, where the content will be search, the other content will the input. So there is nothing here. You can say input, 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 input type, text, all right. Exactly, input type text, right? But it seems like there is now like some sort of class here that is passed through this, right? Nope, it's actually only selecting the input there. Yep, only selecting the input, giving that, which is, this is the height, the padding, top and left, right. So you put it here, this is give you now, you put this, 8, it's now give you this, right? The font size will be whatever is on the root element. Flex is to say, hey, now this is these elements will behave like a flex. The mean width will be 6 times the root. You can put it this, and this is going to shrink now the mean width, right? The mean width. I think they add now some focus, exactly. On focus and the submit button, you're gonna make the index equal to what you can also is override this behavior, right? And now if he wants to search for that label, because there is no class here that was added to, but here you say, hey, this is the HTML form and the name of this input, all right, which is in your case, let's say this is the search input, okay, and similar to this as the ID of the search input, right? But the point of this is that when you are creating each one of these individual tags, what it's doing is JSX calling the React create element with a form followed by the attributes, where right now it doesn't have anything, and the children array. So in other words, is the content that it has, which is now several elements here. Label, input, button, and so on. Here, label is created with the React create elements, and therefore the attribute that is assigned to HTML4, for example, is a search input, and the content of this is search. It creates now another tag called input, where their attribute is the ID search input, and the type text. This doesn't have any content, so we can safely put it like this, a closing tag. It's going to create now another element, which is the button, with the attribute class name with this, as long as other attributes, okay? And inside of the content, it will have now another element, which is the image, that it say, okay, now that you get this, this is the tags that you're going to create. Again, the same process. React create elements. This is the properties here, and the content, because this doesn't have any content. So, and that'll be all. Let's build a Twitter Animal Crossing hybrid, a social network for animals called Critter. Okay, this is now explaining is that.
So we're given this big chunk of HTML and asked to convert it into JSX, and we could do this by going through the code word by word, character by character, looking for anything that has to be converted, but I can't be bothered to do all that. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rely on the JSX compiler to help me find the things that have to be changed by essentially pretending that it is JSX already and trying to render it. Now, this doesn't work because it isn't yet valid JSX, but check it out. The compiler is telling me what the problem is. It's saying that it expected a closing tag for this image element, and sure enough, if I look at the code, I do have an image element which has not been closed. Now, the warning mentions a closing tag, which would technically be this kind of thing right over here. I'm going to solve it with a self-closing tag instead. With that done, we get a new warning telling me that the same problem is happening with an input element, And indeed, that is exactly what's happening, and we'll solve it the same way. With that done, there are no more big scary warnings blocking us from seeing the UI, and everything looks pretty good, but I still have a couple of warnings in the console. The first one is telling me that I need to use HTML4 instead of for, and the second one is telling me that I have to use class name instead of class. You might also have thought that we have to change aria label to make it camel case like every other friggin' attribute that we're talking about, but sadly it is not that consistent. If we try to do that, we'll actually get a warning telling us that we have to change it back. Now, I recognize it's confusing that we've solved the problem, but the warnings are still being shown down here. But the thing is, this is a console. It's showing me all of the output that has happened since the page loaded, and it doesn't automatically clear the console when I make... One thing I want to touch on, because I suspect some of you may be finding it a bit confusing, which is if I go back to how it was with these reserved words being used, like for and class. Well, I get the warning about it, but it actually kind of seems to work. If I click the label, it focuses the input, suggesting that the for attribute actually is working. And if I remove the class, then we definitely see that it is working, because this is not a very attractive looking button. And so, given that for and class work perfectly well, why is React being such a wet blanket? Why is it asking us to change things that don't need to be changed? Well, here's the thing. So far, we've been working exclusively with the primitive tags that are built into the DOM. So button, input, label, right? These are all HTML tags that we're representing in JSX. In React, we also have components, which are a thing that we're going to learn about very, very soon. And I don't want to get ahead of myself, but essentially, when it comes to components, using reserved words like this will cause all sorts of problems. Essentially, we won't be able to access the data because we won't be able to create variables that are named using these reserved words. And so even though technically we can get away with using these reserved words when it comes to these primitive HTML tags, it's still not really a good idea because it doesn't work for everything we might want to do in JSX.
That's interesting. And the other is a Creator. Let's build a Twitter Animal Crossing hybrid, a social network for animals called Creator. Specifically, we'll be implementing the following UI. This. Alright. To help, you have been given two things: a message object containing all the data that you need to populate the UI, and a chunk of HTML which needs to be converted to JSX. So it can be rendered by React. Accepting criteria: the UI should match the mockup using the data from the message object. The data should be referencing using expression slot instead of copy and pasting the data into the JSX. We should access it from the message object, like message content and so on. The user message should be a link, exactly, because we are injecting the content into the JSX. The username should be a link, and it should link to user's handle. With this particular data, it should be users Benjamin like. There is no actual profile page, and so the link won't resolve to anything. That's all right. The avatar image should use the author avatar descriptor for the alt text, and for the timestamp in the footer, we provide a format date function to actually just pass that is. Now, here we are. Okay, and we're just going to create this. So we can just go and say header, right? So I want you to create now the header, where below here I'm actually following is this. I'm gonna create the image, where now this image must render is the injection that I want to tell now JSX to tell React to render. Okay, where in our case is this, it's a message dot author property access to this property avatar source, right? And for the alt, I want you to use now is pretty much the same. All right. but we want to use is now the description here, and of course closing tag of this, so we show this properly. All right. Well, here I don't have access to some of this, so I cannot do that. But that's interesting because there is something called style here that say filter will be a var that I'm going to inject something called shadow elevation high, and it of course is going to say, hey, I cannot do this because I'm trying to now put this so because you're using its inline style, I cannot do that, and the way to do that is by saying, hey, I want you to inject that. But since we want to create now an object of these attributes, CSS attributes, this is how you're going to pass this. So for example, if we don't pass this, what will be the difference? All right. Now we are adding is this slightly different filter around this, right? Good. Then next we're gonna add now the message content here as a paragraph. I want to have this as a paragraph where the content here is this. So I wanna inject this content into JSX and say, hey, message dot content. I want to render this, okay, and then you have now the footer, okay. When you say, hey, this is now posted, followed by a tag that I barely use in my life, which is time, and provide the date time for that, which is, let's going to use now a helper function called format. I want to inject this function here that is going to JSX, that the output is the format that I'm going to pass here, invalid time value here, right? Because JSX actually evaluate this, get into that function and say, hey, but we didn't receive anything here, so this is an invalid time value here. Message dot dot publish it. All right, so the UI must match this, and there is something that we need to add as well, which is the name. The question is that how do we add the name? Well, here they're using now anchor tag to add the name. So I'm going to inject into JSX is this this data, this is string message author dot name. All right. Yeah, but we are not have any href here. Href hyperlink, there is nothing there, and actually this is it, right? Post March 14 at 12 and noon. All right. there you get it. Interesting about the time. Interesting about the time. Posted on March here. So look at what it's doing here, right? Look at what it's doing here, JSX. It say, hey, the first time I'm going to create an element in React with the attribute style that I'm going to pass now an object here, and then on the children or the content is made of these elements here. It's made of a header, it's made of a p, it's made of a footer. And so I'm going to create now an element for the header that doesn't have any attributes bind to, but the content has now two elements here, which is the image followed by the attributes binding. There is no content to be rendered, so that's the end. That's our dead end. And the other is the href. I'm going to create an element where their attribute will be that, and the content is this, right? So far so good. It makes a lot of sense of what is actually doing this, and be able to describe that. And be able to describe that. All right. Well, if we refresh here, so there is no error here. But now we know what the things is doing behind the scenes. Check out the GS primer lesson on the string interpolation if you're not familiar with this syntax. Oh no, but I am. I am familiar with the string interpolations here. I am familiar with the string interpolation. Nevertheless, you have to pass this as an object. Nevertheless, you need to pass that as an object here.
So I'm going to start by grabbing this big chunk of HTML, and I'm going to replace this JSX with it. Essentially, like we did in the previous exercise, I want to let the JSX compiler do the heavy lifting for me. The first thing it spotted is that I have an image tag that is not being closed, and so I'll fix that by making it a self-closing tag. Now with that solved, I have another issue with this image, and in fact we get a nice squiggly underline which highlights that issue in the code directly. This is using something called ESLint, which we're going to cover a little bit later in the course. And the problem here is that I have an image tag that doesn't have an alt attribute. Now, we saw in the acceptance criteria that we want the alt to be equal to this avatar description. And so I could grab this string, right, cartoon bear, and I could paste that in like this. This would indeed set the attribute to the correct value, but I don't actually want to do that. The thing is, like in a real application setting, I wouldn't actually have this JavaScript object, right? This data would live in the database and I would have to fetch it in my code, which means really the content of this object would be a mystery to us. We wouldn't actually know what the values are. And so what we have to do is I have to reference the key value combinations for this message. And so I'm going to create an expression slot, and I'm going to say that the alt should be equal to the message.author.avatar description. With that issue solved, we see that we have another big sort of problem happening, which is that the style property expects a mapping from style properties to values. Essentially, this string right over here is perfectly valid HTML, but that isn't how we apply styles in JSX. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace this with an expression slot. And then inside that expression slot, I'm going to create an object which will map the filter property to a string that contains this particular value. And if you're wondering what the heck this is, like what is var parenthesis dash dash shadow elevation high, this is a CSS variable that is being used to set a drop shadow filter, and I'm applying it to this element, which is why we get this nice sort of purple glow around this card. If I remove this CSS declaration, this is what it would look like without that property, and this is what it looks like with it. I also added a space around this object to really hopefully make clear what's going on here, which is that I have a JavaScript object which is being passed into an expression slot. But the more conventional thing is to keep those squiggly brackets stuck together. You don't usually have a space between them. And so with that done, we now have solved all of the big blocking errors, but obviously things are still not quite right. It's good that we can see that the alt text is being correctly applied, but it would be even better to see the image itself. And so for the source for this image, I'm going to replace it with an expression slot that looks up the message.author.avatar source. Similarly, for the author's name, we'll replace that with message.author.name, and we'll do the same thing for the message content. We also have to update the href for this link, that we want to link to the user's profile page, which doesn't actually exist, but we're pretending that it does. And the format for this is that it should be /users/the user's handle. So in this case, Benjamin Thorne. But again, I don't want to hard code this data. Backtick char, interpolate it, include message.author. Like, it's hard for my brain to really parse what's going on here. So I think it's a little bit nicer to take things like this out of the JSX and to define them above as a variable, which I'm going to call profile URL. Then I'm going to reference that variable inside this expression slot. Ultimately, it's exactly the same thing. Like either way, this property gets set to this value, and it's entirely a subjective preference. So if you'd rather have it sort of directly in the JSX like this, that is totally fine as well. Now, the last little section that we have to deal with is the footer, but there's quite a few things wrong with this footer. The first thing is that I have a warning in the console about the date time property that it has to be camel cased. So I'll replace the lowercase t with an uppercase T. I also notice in the preview pane that the word posted and the word January are stuck together. The white space gotcha has struck again. The reason for this is that even though we have like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 spaces technically between the word posted and the time element, JSX ignores spaces like this because it assumes that they're being used for indentation. The solution is to include a hard-coded single piece of white space like this, and now I see that the words get properly separated. Now for this date time, I'm going to replace the hard-coded value with message.published, and then for this hard-coded sort of humanized, nicely formatted timestamp, I'm going to use the format date function that we've been given, and so I'm going to create a new expression slot that calls this function and passes in message.published. With that done, everything looks good in the preview pane. If I refresh the page, we see that our console is clear, which means that we have successfully solved this exercise.
That's interesting. That's very, very interesting. A search form and a car here. JSX templates. Okay. JSX sometimes compared to template language like handler, bar or ESS or books, but there is an important distinction between two concepts. In this lesson, we're going to see how JSX is a bit of different beast. JSX to template language. This is not the same. For a comparison, let's imagine we have handlebars template like this. They are not the same because one of them is the string interpolation, okay, a template language. Handlebars library includes a JavaScript function that takes a handlebar template and some data and produces an HTML string. So for example, if there are a user by the name of Sujata, we will bring up the following string like this, Sujata. Template language also have custom DLS, domain specific language. Okay? With a special syntax and keyword in the example above, like if a built-in helper that will conditionally render some children. Another helper is each. Here's an important decision. All of that dynamic custom stuff happened when we compile the template. With React, we're compiling JSX to JavaScript. We aren't resolving any of the dynamic stuff yet. We'll learn more about conditional rendering soon, but it's a quick preview. It's here how we do the same thing. Like this. So I want you to evaluate this kind of expression, alright? Hey, if the user exists, good. Then I want you to render this content. And here's what it compiles to. It's going to compile this. You're going to say the attribute doesn't have any attributes, but the content is now a user and the React create element here where it doesn't have any attributes, but it's gonna render the content inside of this, which is whatever you have inside of this property. Notice that our condition hasn't been resolved yet. We don't know if we have a user yet or not. All of this will be handled by JavaScript. Template language are their own special thing. They invent custom syntax like if. In essence, you have to learn an entirely separate language. Learning is subtle difference from JavaScript. JSX is actually a very thin layer of abstraction. It isn't an entirely separate language. We use plain old JavaScript to manage conditions and iteration, and this means you only need to understand one language, JavaScript, to use it effectively. It took me a while to wrap my head around this distinction. Here's another way to put it. Template language turns the markup you write into HTML, and this means they need to invent a custom mini language to do dynamic things, since HTML doesn't have these things built in. But JSX turns the markup you write into JavaScript, and it forwards along any logic it includes with resolving here. Personally, I prefer the JSX approach. I like only having to understand one language. Another benefit, we have the full power of JavaScript available as we write our markup. Template language tend to be pretty narrow in their scope, and so they won't let you do things like filter an array on only select certain items. Instead of being limited to a small number of helpers like each, we have all the JavaScript methods available for us, like filter, slice, and reduce. That's interesting here, especially the difference between the JSX versus the that, bro. Okay, the JSX versus that. JSX versus templates here. And there's a couple exercise here that I really love about it. There's a couple exercise here, bro. Okay. So create now a form here. Alright. And the other is this. And that'll be all for this. We can continue to move on. I think we do. I think we can. honestly. I don't think anything that can stop us. Some exercise. All right. So a search bar and a car. Exactly, a search bar and a car. And then we talk about is the difference between JSX template here. Very, very interesting. JSX versus template. Alright, optional lessons. Some lessons in this course will be marked as optional. These lessons are intended to offer a bit of depth for people, especially curious, how to provide context to a specific subset of a student. So comparing JSX to template language. For example, like this. Comparing JSX to template language. Since template language has their own features to manage dynamic data, whether it is, for example, like if, like if, or each. All right, that you must learn. All right, has its features to manage dynamic data. You must learn, like blade from PHP, from Laravel, or exactly learn like blade from Laravel, or the other is the blade for Laravel. Yeah, blade for Laravel, Shopify, which is using Ruby. Let me get Shopify, Liquid, exactly, or Liquid for Ruby. Okay, or Liquid for Ruby. So the difference here is that JSX, okay, so consider, consider the following. Consider the following example, like this. Okay, here it compiles to this. So the different, there is a different. So the difference is that template language turn the markup you write into HTML. This means you need to invent a custom mini language by yourself. You know, you need to invent a custom mini language by yourself. Templates turn It's like the template language turn the markup you write into HTML directly, which you have to invent some mini custom language to do dynamics things here. However, JSX turn your so JSX transpile or compiles, okay, or turns the markup into a JavaScript code. So we don't need in forwards along any logic here. In forwards alone any logic with it. So without resolving with it, without resolving it. So it means that because of that, we can now use methods like this. So because of that, we can use methods, or we can reuse JavaScript methods like this. Interesting, but that's what it is, man. That's exactly what it is. That's exactly what it is. That's exactly what it is. That's interesting. That's very, very interesting here. That's very, 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 very interesting. So that'll be all for this video. Take care. Bye bye.